I hope you guys are ready to hear more about the new ships because today we're doing a build for the Trailblazer. Now, despite being a science ship, the Trailblazer is actually very well set up for a torpedo build. Now, I've put out more than enough high-end torpedo builds on this channel, so today I'm going to be doing a budget torpedo build. I actually wanted to do something like this a while ago when the Mirror Gagarin came out, but I just kept getting distracted. Fortunately, the Trailblazer has given me an excuse to revisit that build on this ship. I know this looks like a stock Intrepid, but don't worry, this is the Trailblazer. I just like the skin better. I was never actually a big fan of the Warship Voyager design. It really takes away from the cool sleekness of the Intrepid class in my opinion. Now, of the 4 new Terran ships, the Trailblazer is definitely the weirdest, and that's because it's a science warship, which has never actually been done before. This ship comes with 2 features that are very uncommon to science ships. The first being a 4-3 weapons layout, which previously had only ever been done on science spearheads, like the Crossfield or the Bowel Sentry ship. The other being that it has a spinal lance, specifically an agony phaser lance, just like the one on the Lexington. This is especially uncommon. The only other science ship I can think of that has a lance weapon is the Anorax. The Trailblazer is a command ship, so obviously that means I want to put a torpedo build on it. And because this is a C-Store ship, it seemed like a good excuse to do the budget torpedo build that I wanted to do back in October. I kept meaning to do that, but stuff just kept getting in the way. But better late than never. Besides, I think most of you are going to like this ship more than the Mirror Gagarin anyway. You know, because it's an Intrepid class you can put a bunch of guns on. Now the nice thing about the torpedo meta is that most of that gear is reputation or fleet gear, so a good amount of it is actually pretty easy to get. That's why 3 of these 4 torpedoes are probably going to look pretty familiar if you've seen some of my past torpedo builds. First is the enhanced biomolecular photon torpedo from the A472 reputation. This is here because it is one of the hardest hitting torpedoes in the game. Normally I have the Delphic torpedo in the second slot, but that's low by store gear, so I've replaced it with the Quantum Phase torpedo, which comes from the episode Sunrise. This is here because it does increase damage to enemy shields, which is very useful against a torpedo because shields have very high resistances against torpedoes. The next 2 are the Neutronic torpedo from the Delta reputation, and the Dark Matter torpedo from the Discovery reputation, both of which deal some extra radiation damage along with them, making them a bit more powerful, as well as some additional effects. The Dark Matter torpedo also has a set bonus with its console, which gives a stacking buff to crit severity. Next is a deflector from the Fleet Colony for its buff to crit chance and crit severity. Because this is a science ship, I also have a secondary deflector slot. I chose this specific secondary deflector because it adds additional projectile damage. These can also be found at the Fleet Colony. Next is the Impulse engine from the competitive reputation for the speed buffs, which really should be no surprise at this point. And then the Discovery 2-piece in the Warp Core and Shield. The shield is actually really useful because it buffs the shield damage that your weapons will do, and I went with the Warp Core for the sake of the 2-piece bonus. I feel like on a budget build people are going to be a bit more concerned about survivability, so I figured the hull regeneration you get from the 2-piece would be useful there. In the aft weapons are a bunch of mines. The first being a Thoron-infused quantum mine for its extra radiation damage. These can be found in the dilithium store of the Delta reputation. Next is the Tetrion mine launcher from the episode Warriors of the Empire. This is here for its chance to drain enemy shields. And a biomolecular photon mine from the dilithium store of the 8472 reputation. This is here because, like the torpedo, these are also very powerful weapons. Though not quite as powerful as the torpedo, they're still a really good get. Though you could also replace these with mines from the Fleet Colony, which can also be re-engineered for the Radius mod, which will increase the size of the explosion they make. For the devices are, again, a lot of familiar pieces. Kinetic Amplifier for the bonus damage to my projectiles, Deuterium Surplus for the speed buff, Reactive Armor Catalyst for the heal, and a large auxiliary battery to buff my aux power. This one is here for the sake of a console, which I'll get to later. All 4 of these devices are craftable consumables. Normally, I like to include Kobayashi Maru Transponder in my builds, but because it was limited event gear, not everyone has that, so I decided to go without it. Though if you do have it, I would swap out Reactive Armor Catalyst for it. In the consoles, first is Lorca's Custom Fire Control from the Discovery reputation. This is here for its buff to crit chance and shield penetration. It's a torpedo build, so I'm not getting much out of that weapons power buff. And of course, it's 2-piece with the Dark Matter torpedo. These next 3 consoles are also from the reputations. Ordnance Accelerator from the Gamma reputation to reduce the shared cooldown of my mines and buff my projectile damage. Ferrofluidic Hydraulic Assembly from the Terran Task Force reputation to reduce the shared cooldown of my torpedoes. And assimilated modules to buff my crit chance and severity. Next is Enhanced Plasma Manifold off of the Tier 1 Oberth. This is here to buff my non-weapons power subsystems, which I'm using to buff a starship trait. I'm also using it to help with this next console, Phase Space Membrane. This console gives massive buffs to your torpedo damage, but at the cost of drying up your auxiliary power. If you run out of aux power, this console's ability will be cut short. So to help overcome that, I am using both the previous console and those large auxiliary batteries to maintain as much of that auxiliary power as possible. Phase Space Membrane comes off of the Tier 6 Oberth, which is a C-Store ship. These next 2 are also from C-Store ships. Tricobalt Terror Launcher from the Appalachia Blockade Runner. This launches a spread of high-yield Tricobalt torpedoes, which will deal a nice amount of kinetic damage and open up a subspace rift, which will continue to do damage against enemies caught in it. This console also has passive buffs to your mine and torpedo damage, as well as shield penetration, both of which are valuable stats for a torpedo build. The other C-Store ship console is multi-directional artillery barrage off of the new Lexington Dreadnought. This will fire torpedoes at targets in any direction, and additionally, every time a torpedo hits a target, you will gain a bonus damage buff within that weapon's arc, which will scale based on the number of enemies you hit. When we first heard about this console, we were hoping it would end up being a meta torpedo console. It's not performing quite as well as we had hoped, but it still makes a really good budget console. And now to wrap up the consoles, a bunch of vulnerability locators from the Fleet Spire, all of which are buffing my torpedo damage and crit chance. My specializations as usual are Intel Officer for the sake of space flanking, and Temporal as my secondary to gain Entropic Rider. For the personal traits, first I am using Adept of Offense for the crit chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff and then back, Contexted for Kings for the bonus damage buff, Fleet Coordinator for the bonus damage buff based on my team size, Innocuous for the crit severity and the reduced threat generation, Inspirational Leader for the chance to buff most of my starship skills at once, Intel Agent Attaché to lower the cooldown of my captain's abilities, Resonating Payload modification for a stacking debuff against physical and kinetic damage, Self-Modulating Fire to increase my shield penetration when I get a critical hit, Terran Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff, Unconventional Systems to help lower the cooldown of my universal consoles, and normally I would have Boimler effect here for the sake of my Bridge Officer cooldowns, but because this is a budget build, I put Into the Breach here instead, so every time I kill an enemy, I debuff the damage resistance of the surrounding enemies. In the starship traits, all but one of these is a C-Store trait. First is Checkmate off the Yorktown Star Cruiser. Anytime I activate a control ability, I gain a buff to exotic and projectile damage. Next is Entwined Tactical Matrices off the Gagarin Miracle Worker Battlecruiser, which will give me free hits of Torpedo Spread 1 anytime I use Fire at Will or Scatter Volley. Strike from Shadows from the Shran Pilot Escort. This will give me a small buff to crit chance and bonus damage, and reduce my threat generation whenever I fire on an enemy that isn't targeting me. Now, the only trait on here that isn't from the C-Store, Onboard Dilithium Recrystallizer. This one is actually from the lockboxes, but it isn't bound to a starship, so it's pretty easy to get on the exchange. Anytime I activate an engineering ability, I gain a 10% bonus damage buff for each non-weapons power subsystem I have maxed out, giving a potential for a 30% bonus damage buff. This is why I'm using that Tier 1 Oberth console, because it buffs all the subsystems before this trait. Next is Promise of Ferocity off the Endorian Thousand Pilot Escort. Anytime I activate a tactical or pilot ability, my weapons gain a small bonus damage buff. And last is Piercing Projectiles off the Appalachia Blockade Runner. Anytime I activate a torpedo or mine firing mode, I gain a buff to shield and hull penetration. In the space reputations is Advanced Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff, Tyler's Duality for the crit chance buff based on my hull capacity, Precision for more crit chance, Torpedo Pre-Fire Sequence for the bonus damage to my torpedoes, and Omega Kinetic Shearing for the damage over time to my torpedoes. In the Bridge Officer stations, since I am not using Boimler effect, I have had to make room for Aux to Bat, which is why in this universal seat I am using an Engineer. First is Let It Go for the damage debuff, Emit Unstable Warp Bubble for the Unconventional Systems trigger, Aux to Bat for my Bridge Officer cooldowns. In the tactical seat is Fire at Will and Scatter Volley 1 to trigger Entwined Tactical Matrices, and Torpedo High Yield 3 to buff my torpedoes. In the other tactical seat is Chemosite Lace Weaponry for the extra radiation damage to my weapons, and Mine Dispersal Beta to buff my mines. In the Ensign Engineering seat, I just have Emergency Power to Engines for the speed buff. In the Science/Command seat, first is Jam Targeting Sensors for the Unconventional Systems trigger, Photonic Officer for my Bridge Officer cooldowns. This, along with Aux to Bat, I'm running a half-bat build. I would normally run Photonic Officer 2 for that, but I need Concentrate Firepower 3 where it is, which is giving me an extra High Yield 1 and further buffing my torpedo damage. And lastly is Call Emergency Artillery 3, which summon in 3 ships that deal AoEs of kinetic damage. In the Duty Officers, I am using 3 Projectile Officers to reduce the cooldown of my torpedoes. I figured these would be a much more obtainable choice for a budget build, and they're actually kind of necessary since I don't have Ceaseless Momentum. And then of course my 3 Technicians for the Aux to Bat build, for the sake of my Bridge Officer cooldowns. Now, if I were to get my hands on Boimler effect for this, I could make a few changes. I wouldn't need to use an Aux to Bat build, so I can get rid of the 3 Technicians, and replace them with really whatever I wanted. You can do the Emergency Con Hologram to lower the cooldown of evasive maneuvers, or a Warp Core Engineer to further help with your power levels, or really just anything that helps with your DPS. Without the need for Aux to Bat, I would also change that Universal seat to a Science seat, and load that Science Officer with more Unconventional Systems triggers, like Tractor Beam, Sensor Scrambler, Gravity Well, or Photonic Shockwave. I could also get rid of Photonic Officer 1 and do the same thing, though at that point the only unconventional system trigger you have left is Tractor Repulsor, and you want to be careful using that one. You don't want to send enemies flying all over the place, but it is still an option. Now let's move on to the IC and then the Parse. 514k. That's certainly not bad for a budget build. Really goes to show you the power of torpedoes these days. Most of my damage did come from my pets, specifically the artillery vessels from Call Emergency Artillery 3. The biomolecular torpedo is the strongest weapon I had on here, but I'm a little surprised that the biomolecular mine is this high up. I figured it would have been beat out by one of the other torpedoes. So yeah, that is my budget torpedo build for the Trailblazer Science Warship. I hope it helps you in making your own. I am still wanting to do the other two Terran ships, but I'm having a lot of trouble not just jumping right back into the Lexington. I already have a turret build set up on it, and earlier today I thought up of another goofy theme build for it. Hopefully I'll find time for everything, but until then, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. I know, every time, but it is YouTube. It helps the channel and I do appreciate it. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.